Daniel Harper walked down the cobblestones of Marlborough Street, his footsteps echoing in the quiet of Boston's evening. Fog hung over the city like a damp blanket, and the streetlights shimmered in the damp air, reflecting off his navy blue suit. Today, he had won his case, a charge of manslaughter reduced to reckless conduct, a victory that would have made his heart beat faster a decade ago. Now, at 42, it was just another long battle with the prosecutor, another client who would leave without a thank you. All he wanted was a glass of bourbon, a creaking leather chair, and the quiet of his home. The townhouse on the corner rose above the street, its brick facade glowing softly under the gaslights. 3 stories, tall windows, a wrought iron gate that Claire had insisted on because it reminded him of Paris. Daniel pushed the gate open, the metal cool in his palm. The key turned in the lock with a familiar click, and the door swung open, releasing the aroma of freshly brewed coffee that always seemed to permeate their home. He dropped his briefcase by the door, hung his jacket on the coat rack, and inhaled deeply, waiting to hear Claire's footsteps or her voice calling from the kitchen. But the house was silent. "Claire," he called, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. Silence. Just the faint hum of the refrigerator and the distant hum of traffic outside. Daniel frowned, pulled off his tie, and walked into the living room. The gray linen sofa stood untouched, the pillows neatly arranged, just the way Claire liked them. On the wall hung her painting, abstract swirls of blue and ochre that resembled a stormy sea. He'd given her the paints for their 10th anniversary, and she'd laughed at him for investing in chaos. They joked then. He walked up to the kitchen, expecting to find her at her laptop, engrossed in yet another design project. But the kitchen island was empty, with only a single lamp casting a circle of light on the granite countertop. And there, in the center, sat a piece of paper, folded in half. Daniel froze. His fingers trembled as he took the note, feeling his heart tighten, as if anticipating a blow. "Daniel, I'm gone. Please don't look for me. K." 6 words. Black ink on white paper, her handwriting neat and slanted slightly to the right. He reread them, as if the letters might spell out another meaning. "Please don't come looking for me." His gaze darted around the kitchen, searching for clues. The coffee maker was cold, but her favorite mug sat next to it, the daisy-patterned one from their trip to Maine. Inside, there was the stain of half-finished espresso. He touched the mug, as if it might explain where his wife had gone. Daniel sank into a chair, the note still in his hand. They had met 15 years earlier at a Soho gallery show. He had been an intern at a law firm, exhausted but ambitious. Claire was standing in front of a canvas with bold brushstrokes, wearing jeans and a sweater, her hair pulled back into a messy bun. She had seen him staring at the painting and said, "If you tell me this looks like a Rothko, I'm leaving." He had said it was more like the storm in his head after work, and she had laughed. That laugh, light as a bell, had stuck with him. They had married at City Hall 2 years later, without ceremony, just rings and promises. They had decided not to have children. She wanted the freedom to create. He wanted the freedom to pursue his career. Or so he thought. Now, looking at the note, he wondered when it had all gone wrong. Maybe when he started staying at the office until midnight, or when her smiles became less frequent, her conversations shorter. He stood up and went to the window. The street outside was empty, only a street light flickering, as if winking at his confusion. He took out his phone and dialed her number. Straight to voicemail. "Claire, it's me. Please call," he said, knowing she wouldn't answer. Daniel went back to the note and read it again. "Please don't come looking for me." It wasn't a request, but a warning. But why? He knew Claire, she wasn't impulsive. Her decisions were always measured, like her sketches, where every stroke had a purpose. He looked around the kitchen more closely. There were no new notes on the refrigerator, just an old magnet from Portland. The drawer where she kept her notebooks was closed. But on the counter, next to her mug, sat her silver necklace with the star pendant, a gift from him for their 5th anniversary. She never took it off. Never. His fingers tightened around the pendant, the metal warm as if she'd just left it. Daniel felt a lump in his throat. He remembered walking along the beach on Cape Cod, her collecting shells and him complaining about the sand in his shoes. She'd said, "You're too serious, Dan. Just relax for a minute." He'd waved it off, thinking they'd have time. There was no time now. He walked into their bedroom. The bed was made, but that side looked untouched. The closet, its doors slightly ajar. He peered inside. Her clothes were there, but her favorite coat, the green one with the leather buttons, was gone. So was her bag, the one she took on trips. Daniel checked the bathroom. Her toothbrush, her makeup, everything was there. It was confusing. If she was gone for good, why had she left so many things behind? If it was spontaneous, why was the note so cold? He returned to the living room, sat on the sofa, and stared at her painting. The brushstrokes of blue no longer seemed like a storm, but an abyss. Daniel tried to remember their last conversation. Yesterday, the day before. He had been so absorbed in his work that he hadn't noticed her silence. She had asked about his day, and he had answered in monosyllables, his face buried in his papers. Perhaps she had tried to say something, but he hadn't heard it. The phone vibrated, and he grabbed it, expecting to see her name. But it was a colleague, Tony, calling with a business greeting. Daniel hung up. He didn't want to talk about work. Not now. He opened Claire's laptop, which he'd left on the coffee table. The screen lit up, asking for a password. He entered their wedding date. She always used that. The screen unlocked, revealing her desktop, littered with sketch files. One document stood out. Letter. No date, no extension. He clicked on it, but the file was empty. Another mystery. Daniel leaned back, feeling his fatigue give way to anxiety. Claire hadn't just left, she'd left traces he couldn't decipher. A note, a pendant, an empty file. It was like her way of leaving clues, like her paintings, where meaning hid behind colors and shapes. He stood up and walked through the house, checking each room. In her third-floor studio, the easel was empty, but on the table was a sketch, a pencil sketch of a maze, with no beginning or end. It wasn't like her style. He picked it up, feeling the paper tremble in his hands. Outside, it began to rain, the drops pattering on the glass, as if reminding him of time slipping through his fingers. Daniel went back to the note, rereading it for the 10th time. "Please don't look for me." But he couldn't help but look. Claire was his anchor, even if he had forgotten to admit it. He grabbed his keys, put on his coat, and stepped toward the door. He didn't know where to go, but standing still was unbearable. Rain pounded the townhouse windows, turning the night into a blurry watercolor. Daniel sat in the living room, clutching an empty bourbon glass. Claire's note lay on the coffee table, its 6 words seared into his brain like an indictment. He hadn't slept. His phone was silent, and every call to Claire's number went to the empty voicemail. Outside, a street light flickered, its light reflecting off the puddles, mocking his confusion. The doorbell rang, sharp as a gunshot, breaking the silence. Daniel jumped, glanced at his watch. 9:47 p.m. Who could come at such an hour? He stood up, straightened his shirt, wrinkled after hours of immobility, and headed for the door. A silhouette was visible through the frosted glass, a woman's in a long coat. His heart sank. Claire? But he immediately pushed the thought away. She wouldn't come back that easily. He opened the door. Claire's younger sister, Emma, stood there. Her dark hair was plastered to her temples by the rain, and her blue eyes, so like Claire's, were coldly determined. She was 32, but in the dim light of the porch she looked older, with the lines around her mouth, the tense line of her shoulders. Emma worked in marketing in Providence, always sharper than Claire, less given to daydreaming. She held a dripping black umbrella and a leather bag slung over her shoulder. "Emma," Daniel stepped back, letting her in. "What are you doing here?" She shook the water off her umbrella, leaving it by the door, and stepped into the hall, her boots leaving wet marks on the parquet floor. "We need to talk," she said, her voice firm but with a slight tremor that betrayed her nervousness. Daniel closed the door, feeling a sense of unease building in his chest. Emma rarely showed up unannounced. The last time they had seen each other was Christmas, when Claire had hosted a dinner party. Emma had argued with him about politics, her sharp tongue cutting like a knife. Claire had laughed, relieving the tension, But there was no laughter now, only rain and silence. "Come in," he nodded towards the living room, trying to hide his confusion. "Want some coffee or something stronger?" "No," she said, walking past him. Her coat smelled of wet wool and something floral, like Claire's perfume. She stopped at the couch, glancing at the note. "You've already read it." It wasn't a question. Daniel nodded, feeling his throat tighten. "Yes. When did you last talk to her?" Emma took off her coat and threw it over the back of the chair. Her sweater, dark green, was slightly wrinkled, as if she had dressed in a hurry. She opened her bag, took out a folded envelope, and handed it to him. "It's from her," she said, looking him straight in the eye. "Read it, but don't expect to like it." Daniel took the envelope, his fingers trembling. It was plain, white, unmarked, but heavy to the touch, as if it contained not only paper, but also a truth he didn't want to know. He sat up, tore the edge, pulled out the sheet. Claire's handwriting, the same neat slant as the note in the kitchen. "Danielle, I know you'll be angry. Maybe I hate myself. I left with Michael. I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner. It's not your fault, but it's not just mine. Claire." Michael. The name hit him like a hammer. Michael Reed, his friend from Harvard Law School. Tall, with a touch of gray in his dark hair, always with a charming smile that had gotten him out of trouble. Daniel had gotten him out of trouble more than once, first from credit card debt, then from a fraud suit when Michael had gotten tangled up in client accounts. They had shared beers in a bar on Charles Street, laughing over old stories. Michael had been at their wedding, toasting their happiness. And now this. "Michael," Daniel managed, his voice hoarse. "She left with Michael." Emma nodded, crossing her arms, her gaze hard but not judgmental. "She called me 2 days ago," she said. "She said she was leaving. Didn't go into details, but she asked me to tell you this." "Why didn't you call me right away?" Daniel stood up, clutching the letter. His fingers crumpled the paper as if they could erase the words. "Because she asked me not to call," Emma raised her voice, but then stopped, as if regretting her harshness. "She wanted you to find out from the letter." "I don't know, Daniel. It's her choice." He paced the room, anger and hurt warring inside him. Michael. He remembered him coming to their house last summer, bringing a bottle of Pinot Noir, joking with Claire about her paintings. Daniel had been busy with his laptop, so he hadn't noticed how long they'd talked. Or had he noticed and not cared? Now every moment felt like evidence. "Did you know?" he asked, stopping at the window. The rain was getting heavier, and drops were hitting the glass like bullets. "I knew they." "No," Emma shook her head. "I didn't know about Michael. Claire didn't share things like that. But she was unhappy. Did you see that?" Daniel froze. Unhappy. The word cut like a blade. He remembered her silence at dinner, her habit of staying in the studio until late. He thought it was just her creative process, or his excuse for not noticing. "Did she tell you anything?" he asked, turning to Emma. "Something that would explain why." Emma sighed and sank down onto the couch, her fingers fiddling with the hem of her sweater. She said that she felt invisible, that you live in your own world, trials, clients, victories. She didn't blame you, but she felt lonely. Daniel felt the floor shift beneath his feet. He leaned against the windowsill, looking out at the blurry street. Lonely. He remembered Claire once asking him if he wanted to take a vacation, go to Vermont, just the two of them. He waved her off, too busy. Michael apparently didn't wave her off. "Why Michael?" he asked, almost in a whisper. "Of all people." Emma shrugged. "I don't know. Maybe he was listening to her. Maybe he was there when you weren't." Daniel clenched his fists. He remembered Michael calling him a week ago, asking for advice on a case. The voice was casual, friendly, no innuendo. Or did he just not want to see them? He turned to Emma. "Where is she now? Do you know?" "She didn't say." Emma looked at her hands. "She was just leaving and not to worry. I tried calling her yesterday, but her phone was turned off." Daniel pulled out his phone, found Michael's number. He dialed it, but like Claire, it went to voicemail. Michael Reed, leave a message. He threw the phone on the couch, feeling his anger turn to helplessness. What are you going to do? Emma asked, her voice softening. I don't know, he admitted. She asked me not to look, but I can't just sit there. Emma nodded, but her gaze was distant, as if she was not telling the whole story. She stood up and grabbed her coat. I need to go. If I find out anything, I'll call. Emma, Daniel stopped her at the door. If she contacts you, tell her that I need to talk to her. She looked at him, her eyes softening. I'll tell you. But Daniel, think about what you want. For her, and for yourself. She was gone, leaving behind the smell of rain and silence. Daniel went back to the letter, reread it. Michael. The name burned like a hot coal. He remembered their college days, how they had studied laws until dawn, how Michael had joked that Daniel was his prison insurance. Now that insurance has turned into betrayal. He went to the bar and poured himself another bourbon, but didn't drink it. Instead, he went back to the bedroom and opened Claire's closet. Her green coat was still missing, but he noticed that her favorite shoes, the black ones with the low heels, were also missing. Little things, but they added up to a picture he couldn't figure out. He went back to the living room and looked at Claire's painting on the wall. The blue brushstrokes no longer seemed like an abyss, but a cage from which she had escaped. Daniel sat up, clutching the letter. The rain continued to fall, but now it sounded like a metronome, counting down to his next step. He didn't know where to look for Claire, but Michael was the real target, and Daniel would find him. Not for revenge, but for answers. Morning light filtered through the curtains, cutting sharp stripes into the living room of the townhouse. Daniel Harper sat on the couch, still wearing the wrinkled shirt he'd been wearing since last night. An empty bourbon glass sat on the coffee table, next to Claire's letter, crumpled from repeated readings. I left with Michael. I'm sorry. The words burned like embers, leaving behind only the ashes of trust. He hadn't slept, his eyes burning with fatigue, his thoughts swirling around betrayal, Claire, Michael, their laughter behind him. His phone lay next to him, the screen dark, unanswered. He'd called Michael until midnight, but each call had gone to voicemail. The doorbell rang, startling him out of his stupor. Daniel winced, spilling the last of his bourbon on his wrist. He glanced at his watch. 8:12 am too early for company, too late for any hope of it being Claire. He stood, his bones aching from a night of sitting, and headed for the door. A figure peered through the frosted glass, familiar but unexpected. Emma, again. He opened the door, and the cold Boston air rushed in, carrying the smell of wet asphalt. Emma was standing on the porch, wearing a gray wool coat, her hair pulled back into a low ponytail. Her face, usually sharp, was softened by shadows under her eyes, as if she, too, hadn't slept. In her hands was a paper bag with the logo of the coffee shop on the corner. I thought you could use some coffee, she said, her voice soft, but with a slight tremor that betrayed the tension. Can I come in? Daniel stepped back to let her pass, his mind clinging to her presence like a lifeline, but something in her gaze too long, too warm made him wary. You're back, he said, closing the door. Why? Emma walked into the living room and set the package down on the table next to the letter. She noticed it but looked away, as if she didn't want to acknowledge its existence. She pulled out 2 cups of coffee and handed one to Daniel. The aroma of espresso filled the room, mingling with the stale smell of last night's bourbon. I couldn't just leave yesterday, she said, sitting on the edge of the couch. Her fingers fiddled with the lid of her cup. After what you learned, no one should be left alone with that. Daniel took the coffee but did not drink it. He looked at Emma, trying to understand what was behind her words. She was Claire's younger sister, but she had always seemed different, more direct, with a sharp tongue that cut without mercy. At Claire's wedding 10 years ago, she had stood to the side, wearing a blue dress too elegant for her then 22. He remembered the way she had looked at him, then not with envy, but with something he could not decipher. Now that look was back, sharper than it had been yesterday. Did you know about Michael? He asked, sitting down opposite her. His voice was hoarse, as if the words were stuck in his throat. Emma shook her head, her fingers hovering over the cup. No, Claire didn't share this with me, but I saw that she was distancing herself. From you, from everyone, she was like a shadow these last months. Daniel squeezed the glass, feeling the warmth through the cardboard. A shadow. He remembered Claire sitting in her studio, surrounded by canvases, but her eyes were empty. He'd assumed it was just fatigue. Now he saw the signs he'd missed: her silence at dinner, her habit of going to bed before him. And Michael Reed, with his easy smile and his knack for finding words that Daniel had always lacked. They'd met at Harvard, sharing pizza in the dorm, arguing legal issues until they were hoarse. Daniel had saved him twice, first from debt when Michael was bogged down with student loans, then from a lawsuit when he was accused of falsifying a client's accounts. And all the while, Michael had drank his wine, joked with his wife, and waited for his chance. He was my friend, Daniel said, looking at the floor. I trusted him, and he stole her, Emma finished, her voice firmer. She leaned closer, her hand hovering for a moment, as if to touch him, but stopped. Michael was always like that, Daniel. Took what he wanted, without regard for others. Remember how he bragged about his schemes at parties? You saved him, and he laughed behind your back. Daniel looked up. Her words had hit home, igniting the spark that had been smoldering inside him since yesterday. He remembered Michael once, after his third glass of whiskey, calling it his ticket out of any mess. It sounded like a joke then. Now it sounded like a taunt. Do you think he planned this? He asked, feeling his anger rise like a tide. Emma shrugged, but her eyes blew like Claire's, but with a different fire never left his. I think he saw a chance, and he took it. Claire was vulnerable, alone, and he knew how to say what she wanted to hear. She paused, and in that pause Daniel felt her gaze, too long, too close. He stood up, walked to the window, where the morning light reflected in the puddles outside. Emma was always there, at family dinners, at Claire's birthday parties. She joked with him, argued with him, but she never crossed the line. Or did she? He remembered how she had held his hand last Christmas as she handed him a plate, and how her fingers had trembled. He hadn't thought much of it then. Now it seems different. Why are you here, Emma? He asked, turning around. It's not for coffee. She smiled, but it was a forced smile, as if she was hiding a crack. Because I know what it's like to feel abandoned. Claire did it to you. And to me, she always left when things got tough. And Michael, he just took advantage of that. Her voice wavered, and Daniel saw her lips pressed together, as if holding back unnecessary words. He remembered Claire telling him that Emma had been in her sister's shadow as a young girl, less talented, less loved by her parents. But Emma had never complained. She had built her career, her life, but she had always come back to Claire, and to him. You want me to do something? He asked, feeling her words pushing him over the edge. Follow them? Find him? Emma stood up, stepped closer. Her hand touched his shoulder, a light touch, but it burned. I want you to not let them get away with it, she said quietly, but there was steel in her voice. Michael doesn't deserve her, and he doesn't deserve your silence. You're a lawyer, Daniel. You know how to make people pay for their mistakes. Her words hung in the air like smoke. Daniel felt the anger he had been holding back flare up. He imagined Michael, his smile, his hand on Claire's shoulder, their laughter somewhere far away. He clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. I don't know where they are, he said, but his voice shook with rage. She asked me not to look. Will you listen? Emma tilted her head, her gaze almost challenging. Will you let him take her after everything you've done for him? Daniel turned away, looking at Claire's painting on the wall. The blue marks now looked like bruises. He remembered Michael sitting here, on this very couch, telling jokes while Claire laughed. Were they together then? Or had it started later, when Daniel was busy with his work, leaving her alone? I don't know what to do, he admitted, his voice growing quieter. I thought we still had a chance. Emma moved closer, her hand landing on his shoulder again, but this time she didn't remove it. "You deserve better, Daniel," she said, her voice soft, almost a whisper. "You were always better than them. Don't let them think they've won." Her words were like sparks falling on dry grass. Daniel felt his anger harden into something hard, determined. He didn't know where to look for Claire or Michael, but the thought of letting them disappear was unbearable. He looked at Emma, her face so close he noticed freckles on her cheeks he hadn't seen before. She was like Claire, but different, more alive, more real in this moment. "Thank you," he said, stepping back to break her touch. "For the coffee, and for this." Emma nodded, but her eyes lingered on him a little too long. She picked up her coat and headed for the door. "If I hear anything about Claire, I'll call," she said, standing in the doorway. "But think about what you want. For yourself." She left, leaving behind the scent of coffee and a hint of perfume. Daniel returned to the couch, picked up Claire's letter. He no longer saw it as an apology, only a challenge. Michael. He would find it. Not for Claire, but for himself. Thin rays of morning sunlight filtered through the blinds of Daniel Harper's office, streaking the oak of his desk. Outside, Boston was buzzing horns, footsteps, snatches of conversation on Washington Street. But inside his office, on the 6th floor of the law firm of Crow and Associates, the only sound was the hum of his laptop. Daniel stared at the screen where the cursor blinked in the LexisNexis search bar. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. Michael Reed, a name that a week ago had conjured up memories of beer and laughter, was now a target. It had been a day since Emma had visited him and had told him Michael didn't deserve forgiveness. Her voice, soft but sharp, rang in his head like the echo of a gavel. "You're a lawyer, Daniel. You know how to make people pay." He hadn't slept, scrolling through Claire's letter, her handwriting, her betrayal. Michael, his friend, his debtor, had stolen his wife. But Daniel wasn't going to sit back. He knew how to find the truth or shadows of it. He typed into the search bar, "Michael James Reed, Boston, Massachusetts." LexisNexis, the database he'd been using for years, pulled up results: court records, property registrations, corporate documents. Daniel was a criminal defense lawyer, but his work had taught him to dig deeper, to where the truth hid behind numbers and signatures. He started with cases. In 2018, he got Michael out of trouble with a fraud claim when a client accused him of falsifying invoices. Daniel convinced the judge it was an accountant's mistake, but now he wondered, was Michael really that innocent? The screen showed 3 new results. 2 were minor parking tickets, nothing serious. The third was a company registration, Reed Consulting, set up last year. Daniel frowned. Michael had never mentioned consulting. His firm handled civil cases, contracts, divorces, real estate disputes. Why would he need a new company? He jotted down the address. An office in the South End, not particularly prestigious, but not cheap either. That was the first clue. Daniel leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. His office, with its bookcases lined with criminal law volumes and its view of the skyscrapers, was usually a calming place. But today the walls were as oppressive as an interrogation room. He pulled out his phone, opened his contacts. Tom Keller, ex-cop, fired for what he called overzealousness. Now a private investigator, working for those who paid cash and asked no questions. Daniel dialed the number. "Keller," Tom's voice was hoarse, as if he'd been smoking all night. "Harper, is that you? Haven't called in a while." "I need your help," Daniel said, trying to keep his voice even. "It's personal." A pause, then a chuckle. "Personal? What, your wife ran off with a client?" Daniel clenched his jaw. Tom was always too perceptive. "With a friend," he replied. "Michael Reed. I need to know where he is, and with whom." Tom whistled. "A friend, then. Tough. What do you have?" "Name, his office address, a couple of old cases. I want to know where he is now, who he's meeting, where he's spending his money. And no leads, Tom. This is not for the court." "Got it," said Tom. "Give me a day. Meet me at the Rusty Anchor, 7 o'clock. I'll bring you what I can find." Daniel hung up, feeling the adrenaline pumping through his veins. He went back to his laptop and opened Westlaw, another database he used to check case law. But this time, he wasn't interested in law. He was interested in finance. He typed in Michael's details, hoping to find bank records or tax returns. Access was restricted. Lawyers couldn't just rummage through someone else's accounts without a warrant. But Daniel had connections. He shot a quick message to Lisa, an analyst at the firm who knew how to navigate bureaucratic hurdles. Lisa, check Michael Reed's financial records. Consulting firm, incorporated last year. Anything you find, confidential. He sent the message, knowing Lisa wouldn't ask questions. She owed him for helping her with her divorce 2 years ago. Daniel leaned back, looking at the photo on the table, him and Claire in Cape Cod, her hair blowing in the wind, his smile forced. He put the frame in a drawer. No time for reminiscing. By midday, Lisa had sent a reply. I found transactions for Reed Consulting. Several large transfers over the last 3 months. One to an account in Providence. I can confirm the address. Anything else you need? Providence. Emma's city. Daniel felt his chest tighten. Coincidence? Or were Michael and Claire there? He replied, check the address, and check for other accounts in his name. He knew it was risky. Accessing financial data without a warrant could cost him his license. But the anger, fueled by Emma's words, overrode caution. By 5 o'clock, Daniel had collected a folder of data, Michael's office address, his company records, a few old lawsuits. But that wasn't enough. He needed a lead reel, tangible. He closed his laptop, put on his coat, and headed to the Rusty Anchor, a bar on the waterfront that smelled of beer and old wood. Tom was waiting for him in a corner booth, a mug in his hand, a folder on the table. His face, scarred from street fights, looked tired, but his eyes were bright. Harper, Tom nodded, moving the folder. You look like crap. Thanks. Daniel sat down and ordered a soda. Alcohol was a bad idea right now. What did you find? Tom opened the folder, pulled out several photographs. Michael leaving a cafe in the South End. Michael getting into a black sedan. In one photo, there was a woman next to him, but her face was hidden by a hat. Claire. Daniel peered at it, his heart pounding, but he wasn't sure. Your friend is always on the move, Tom said, sipping his beer. The South End office is a dummy, a post office box, no staff. But he rents an apartment in Cambridge. The address is here, and he called a number listed in Providence last night. 20 minutes. Providence, Daniel repeated, remembering Lisa's message. Who owns the number? I don't know yet, Tom shrugged. My connections in the police aren't as fast as they used to be, but I can dig deeper, for an extra fee. Daniel nodded, taking out his wallet. He handed Tom a wad of cash without counting it. Find out who he's with, and where. Tom chuckled, putting the money away. Are you sure you want to know? Sometimes the truth is worse than you think. I already know the worst, Daniel said, his voice cold as steel. I want the facts. He returned home to the townhouse, where the silence now seemed hostile. He set Tom's folder on the kitchen island, next to Claire's mug, and opened it. Photos, addresses, phone records. He noticed one detail, a receipt from the cafe where Michael had been in the photo. The bill was for two coffees, one with almond milk. Claire always had almond milk. He clutched the receipt, feeling the anger return, fueled by Emma's words. Don't let them think they've won. Daniel pulled out his laptop and logged into the firm's database via VPN. He entered the address of the Cambridge flat, checked the registration. The lease was registered to Reed Consulting. No sign of Claire. He opened her social media profile. She hadn't updated it in months. But in an old post, he noticed a photo of Michael and him laughing at a party. He hadn't thought much of it then. Now, every comment felt like evidence. The phone vibrated. A text from Lisa. Providence address, North Star Motel. Payment for $5,000 sent 3 days ago. Nothing else. Motel. Daniel imagined Claire in a cheap room with a neon sign outside the window. With Michael. His fingers gripped the phone so tightly the screen would have cracked if he hadn't stopped. He stood up and walked to the window. Boston was as gray as his thoughts behind the glass. Emma was right, he couldn't let them go. But what would he do when he found them? The courtroom scene, where he exposed the witness, seemed simpler than this game, where the rules changed with every step. He took the photo from Tom's folder, the one with the woman in the hat walking next to Michael. Her posture, her walk, everything screamed Claire. But Daniel knew that to win, he needed more than anger. He needed the truth, and he would find it, even if it broke him. Daniel Harper's dark gray Audi sped down I-95, cutting through the morning fog that lay across the highway. Boston was behind them, its skyscrapers fading into the gray sky, and Providence, a city that might hold answers, awaited them. Daniel's fingers were white on the steering wheel. Emma sat in the passenger seat next to him, her profile silhouetted against the cloudy window. She scrolled through her phone, her expression focused, but her lips trembling with inner turmoil. They were headed to the North Star Motel, where Lisa had said Michael Reed had sent $5,000. Claire and Michael might be there, or they might not be. Daniel didn't know which was worse. Emma had shown up at his office the night before, after he'd gotten the data from Tom Keller. She stood in the doorway, wearing jeans and a light jacket, her eyes full of determination. "I'm coming with you," she said, without asking permission. Daniel wanted to protest, but her tone, a mixture of sympathy and stubbornness, stopped him. He didn't know why she insisted, but her presence, oddly, gave him strength. Claire's younger sister, Emma, with her sharp tongue and marketing acumen, didn't look like a lawyer, but her determination complemented his methodical approach. They had become allies, united in a common goal, finding the truth. "Are you sure it's worth it?" Emma asked, still glued to her phone. Her voice was calm but slightly hoarse, as if she hadn't slept. "It's worth it," Daniel replied, keeping his eyes on the road. "If they're there, I want to know. If not, I'll still find them." Emma nodded, her fingers hovering over the screen. She pulled up Michael's LinkedIn profile, where he proudly described himself as a strategic solutions consultant. Daniel glanced at her phone. Michael had updated the page 3 days ago, adding a new client recommendation. The smile on his avatar seemed mocking. "He was always slippery," Emma said, her tone sharpening. "Remember how he bragged about his deals, and you cleaned up after him." Daniel clenched his jaw. He remembered Michael, after another reputation had been saved, clapping him on the shoulder, calling him brother. Now the word stung. He had saved Michael from debt, from lawsuits, from failure, and Michael had taken Claire. Providence greeted them with gray streets and a musty smell. The North Star Motel was on the outskirts of town, in a neighborhood where neon signs rubbed shoulders with peeling facades. The building was 2 stories tall, with peeling paint and a blinking sign where the letter Z barely glowed. Daniel parked outside, next to a rusty pickup truck. Emma got out first, her sneakers crunching on the gravel. "This doesn't look like a place for a romantic getaway," she said, looking around the motel. Her voice was light, but her eyes were worried. Daniel didn't answer. He picked up Tom's folder containing the photos of Michael and the receipt from the cafe. They walked into the lobby, which smelled of cheap air freshener and stale tobacco. Behind the counter sat a woman in her 50s, with a tired face and bright red lipstick. She leafed through a magazine without looking up. "The number is for Michael Reed or Claire Harper," Daniel said, trying to sound neutral. The woman looked at him over her glasses. "No one with those names. Are you reserving rooms?" Emma stepped forward, her smile warm but professional, a marketer at work. "Maybe someone paid for the room with a card? 3 days ago, $5,000? The woman frowned, but opened her laptop and ran through the entries. "There was a payment, yes, cash, not a card. Number 12. But they left yesterday. A man and a woman, no names." Daniel felt his heart tighten. Yesterday. They were late. Emma touched his elbow, her fingers lingering a second too long. "Can I see the number?" he asked, taking a 20 out of his wallet. The woman shrugged, took the money, and handed over the key. "Just make it quick." Number 12 was on the second floor, overlooking the car park. The door creaked, revealing a dark room with faded wallpaper and a musty smell. The bed was made, but a forgotten packet of gum lay on the nightstand Claire's favorite mint. Daniel froze, staring at it as if it were evidence. Emma walked to the window and pulled back the curtains. Light fell on the dusty carpet, but revealed nothing. "They were here," she said quietly, "and then they left. As always, she runs away." Daniel didn't answer. He checked the trash can empty. In the bathroom, nothing but a dirty towel. Disappointment washed over him like a wave, but he pushed it down. They were late, but that wasn't the end of it. He turned to Emma. "We need a plan," he said. "Not just find them. Make them regret it." Emma looked at him, her eyes flashing. "I'm with you. What are you up to?" They returned to the car, where Daniel opened his laptop. Providence was left behind, but their conversation continued as the Audi sped back to Boston. Daniel knew his legal skills were a weapon. Michael had left traces, and he would find them. "First," he began, "we hit his company. Reed Consulting is a weak point. I saw the transactions. They are murky. We can request an audit through the IRS. I have a friend at the IRS. He owes me a favor." Emma nodded, her fingers flying across her phone, pulling up Michael's company website. "There's almost nothing here, just generalities about strategic decisions. But I can dig through his social media. People always leave traces, photos, geolocations, connections." "Okay," Daniel said. "Find everything you can. Clients, partners, even old posts. If he was bragging about deals, there'll be something useful there." He remembered the case from 2018 when he saved Michael from a lawsuit. He found discrepancies in the client's accounts, but didn't dig deeper. Now he regrets it. "I'll check his old cases through Westlaw. If there's anything illegal, I'll file a complaint on behalf of an anonymous client. That will tie his hands." Emma smiled, but her smile was sharp as a blade. "And the finances? You were talking about transfers. Can we freeze his accounts?" Daniel nodded. "If we can prove that Reed Consulting is money laundering or tax evasion, I can file a motion in court. But we need dirt. Specific. Tom Keller is already looking for his calls and movements. You can help with public data, his profiles, connections, everything he hasn't managed to hide." "I know how to look," Emma said, her voice firmer. "He thinks he's got you wrapped around his little finger, but he doesn't know who he's dealing with." Her words struck a chord in Daniel. He remembered the look in her eyes at the motel, her hand on his arm. She had been there when Claire had left, and now her resolve fueled him. But something in her tone, too personal, too hot, made him wonder. Why was she so eager to punish Michael? Because of Claire, or because of him? They stopped at a gas station near the state line. While Daniel filled up, Emma sat in the car, scrolling through social media. "Found it," she said, holding up the screen. A photo of Michael at a restaurant, drinking wine. The date was 2 days ago. The geolocation was Providence. The woman next to her was cropped out, but her green coat was familiar. "Claire." "They were here," Daniel said, his voice cold. "And they left." Emma touched his hand, her fingers warm. "We'll find them, and make them answer. Together." Back in Boston, they sat in his office, plotting. Daniel sketched out the steps: an IRS inquiry into Reed Consulting, a complaint to the bar based on Michael's old cases, surveillance through Tom to gather dirt. Emma suggested creating a fake profile to coax information out of Michael's associates and checking his bank transactions through public records. They worked until midnight, their voices mingling with the city's nighttime noise outside. With Emma gone, Daniel was left alone, staring at the file. The plan was set, but questions remained. Where was Claire? Why had she chosen Michael? And was Emma motivated by compassion or something more? He didn't know, but he felt like the game was just beginning. Outside the townhouse, the darkness thickened like ink spilled across the Boston sky. Inside, in the living room, the light from the desk lamp picked out the corners of the room, casting harsh shadows on the hardwood floors. Daniel Harper stood at the bookcase, his fingers clutching a folder of papers, transaction printouts from Reed Consulting, notes from Tom Keller, a draft of the complaint he and Emma had been preparing. His plan for revenge against Michael Reed, his former friend and now traitor, lay before him like a weapon loaded but not yet fired. Providence had been a dud, the North Star Motel a mockery of his hopes. Claire and Michael had slipped away, but Daniel sensed the time was near. Emma, her words about Michael not deserving forgiveness, rang in his head, urging him on. The doorbell rang like a blade in the silence. Daniel froze, his gaze flickering to the clock on the wall. 10:49 p.m. Emma. She had promised to come by tomorrow with an update on social media. But this call was sharp, almost panicked, like an alarm. He walked down to the hall, his heart pounding, anticipating change. A figure was visible through the frosted glass of the door. Frail, hunched, in a green coat, he knew better than he wanted to. Claire. He pushed the door open, and the cold air rushed in, carrying the scent of damp asphalt and her perfume, lavender with a hint of vanilla. Claire stood on the porch, her face pale as a sheet, her hair a tangled mess, plastered to her cheeks. Her eyes, once bright like the sea in her paintings, were now dull, with dark circles under them. She clutched her bag, her fingers shaking, and there was a bruise on her wrist, purple like the shadow of betrayal. She looked broken, not the same woman who had left the note asking him not to look for her. Daniel, her voice was hoarse, almost a whisper. I have nowhere to go. Please, let me in. He stood still, his mind screaming anger, pain, fury, but his body retreated, letting her in. She walked into the hall, her steps cautious, as if she feared the house would reject her. Daniel closed the door, and silence fell upon them, heavy as a sentence. What are you doing here? He asked, his voice sharp as a scalpel. Crawling back after destroying everything? Claire froze, her bag hitting the floor with a thud. She looked up, then looked away, clenching her hands. I was wrong, Daniel. I need space to collect myself. Wrong? He stepped closer, his voice rising like the wind before a storm. You ran away with my friend Claire, with Michael. You betrayed me, jumped into his bed, and now that he's shown his true colors, you stand here and ask for shelter. Are you serious? Her face twitched, her lips trembled, but she didn't back down. I don't. It's not that simple. He wasn't what he seemed. I thought he'd give me my freedom, but... Freedom? Daniel laughed, but the laughter was bitter, like poison. You wanted freedom. From what? From our home? From me? I worked to give you everything this house, your studio, your paints, and you chose him. Michael, sitting at our table, drinking my wine, calling me brother. And you think you can just go back like nothing happened? Claire sank down onto the sofa, her hands clutching the cushions. On the wall behind her hung her painting, blue swirls like the storm that now raged between them. I know I hurt you, she said quietly. But I was alone, Daniel. You ignored me. You lived in your business, in your lawsuits, in your victories. And Michael, he listened. Listened. Daniel took a step toward her, his fists clenched. He listened so he could get you into his game. Do you even realize what you're getting yourself into? He's deeply in debt, Claire. His company is a house of cards, ready to collapse. And you ran off with him, leaving me with a note like I was some kind of idiot. Her eyes filled with tears, but she did not cry. She raised her head, her voice firmer. I didn't know about the debts when I left. He promised a new life and said everything was under control. But then, he changed. He screamed, he threatened. Yesterday, he threw the phone across the room when I asked about the money. I was scared, Daniel. He froze, his gaze falling on the bruise on her wrist. Purple, like a fingerprint. The anger flared brighter, but it wasn't just directed at Claire now. Michael, the one he'd saved from lawsuits, from debt, from failure. The one who'd sat on this very couch, joking with Claire while Daniel buried himself in paperwork. His betrayal wasn't just personal, it was a knife in the back. Scared, he said, his voice lower but still caustic. You ran away with him, thinking he was your knight, and now you come crawling back because he showed his fangs? What am I supposed to do, Claire? Forget how you spit on our marriage. Forgive you because you missed. I'm not asking for forgiveness, she said, her voice shaking but gaining strength. I'm asking for help. I have nowhere to go. Michael, he won't let me go just like that. He said I have to keep quiet or else. Otherwise what? Daniel leaned closer, his eyes burning. What will he do? Hit you again? Or run to me like before, so I can pull him out of another hole? Do you even realize that he used you like he used me? Claire covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking. I didn't know, she whispered. I found letters, threats from people. He owed them hundreds of thousands. He said he'd fix it, but I could see how panicked he was. I couldn't stay. Daniel stepped back, his anger still simmering, but now with a cold clarity. Claire wasn't just a runaway returning home. She was a witness. Her words, her bruise, her fear, all of it was weaponry in his plan against Michael. The plan he'd been making with Emma could now become reality. But accepting Claire wasn't forgiveness. It was a move in a game he was going to win. You can stay, he said, his voice level but firm as a sentence. But it's not for our sake. You'll tell me everything where you were, what he did, who his creditors are. If you want shelter, you'll play by my rules. Claire looked up, a mixture of relief and fear in her eyes. Okay, she said, I'll tell you everything. He brought her a glass of water and set it on the table. As she drank, he noticed how her fingers trembled, how the bruise on her wrist stood out against her pale skin. His anger had not subsided, but it was no longer directed just at her. Michael, his debts, his aggression, his lies. Daniel knew how to exploit it. He sat down, picked up a notebook, his handwriting as clear as court papers. Start with where you were after Providence, he said, and don't leave anything out. Claire said, her voice quiet but clear. The townhouse kitchen smelled of garlic and basil, steam rising from a pan of sizzling shrimp. Daniel Harper stood at the stove, stirring a sauce, his movements precise, almost mechanical. On the table sat a bottle of Pinot Grigio, 2 glasses, and plates of neatly arranged pasta. On the outside, he looked like a husband preparing dinner for his wife, who had returned from a long absence. But inside, his thoughts were cold as steel. Claire, sitting in the living room, was not just his wife. She was the key to Michael Reed, a pawn in the game he was playing with Emma. It had been a day since Claire had shown up on his doorstep, broken, with a bruised wrist and a tale of debt and Michael's rage. Daniel had taken her in, but not out of love. Her words about the Falcon Group, the threatening letters, the bill for hundreds of thousands of dollars, all of it had been fuel for his plan. Emma, whose voice still rang in his ears, make him pay, would have been pleased. But Claire didn't know that her every breath, every word, was now serving his purpose. Dinner's ready, he called, his voice warm, almost gentle, like the times they'd shared wine and laughter. He wiped his hands on a towel, glanced at his phone, face down. A text from Tom Keller had arrived an hour ago. Falcon Group, more than just investors. Offshore connections. Digging further. Daniel didn't answer, but his mind was already plotting. An IRS complaint, a bar review, a possible fraud suit. Claire walked into the kitchen, her steps quiet, as if she were afraid to break the fragile truce. She was wearing an old sweater she'd left in the closet, her hair pulled back into a messy bun. The bruise on her wrist was hidden by the long sleeve, but Daniel noticed the way she tugged at the fabric to hide it. She smiled, faintly but genuinely. It smells like a restaurant, she said, sitting down at the table. You didn't have to. I did, he said, setting the plate in front of her. His smile was as rehearsed as a courtroom argument. You look tired. Eat. She nodded, picked up her fork, but her eyes avoided his. Daniel sat across from her, pouring the wine, watching her. On the outside, he was a caring husband, but inside, his thoughts were sharp as blades. Claire knew more than she was telling, and he was going to get it out. How are you today? He asked, his tone gentle but slightly insistent. After everything, are you feeling better? Claire twirled the glass in her hands, her fingers leaving marks on the glass. A little. Thank you for letting me in. I know this isn't easy for you. Not easy? He raised an eyebrow, keeping the smile, but his voice became a little sharper. You're right, but we'll figure it out. Tell me more about what happened with Michael. It will help. She froze, her fork hovering over her pasta. I told you everything. He was aggressive. Debts, threats. I don't know the details. Daniel leaned closer, his eyes narrowed, but his tone controlled. You saw the letters, Claire. From the Falcon Group, from the lawyers. These aren't just debts. What did he say? Who does he owe? She sighed, her shoulders slumping. He didn't share, but I heard his calls. He was arguing with someone, mentioning Bermuda, some bills. He said it was his business, and for me to stay out of it. Bermuda, offshore. Daniel wrote it down in his mind, his lawyer brain already building the chain. Reed Consulting could be a money laundering front. He knew how to file a request with the IRS to trigger an audit. But he needed more. He smiled, pouring her more wine. You did the right thing by leaving, he said, his voice warm, but inside he was as cold as a Boston winter. We'll figure this out together. Claire nodded, her eyes softening. She trusted him, or wanted to. Daniel felt a pang of guilt, but he pushed it down. Emma was right. Michael didn't deserve forgiveness. And Claire, she was part of his plan, even if she didn't know it. After dinner, he went into his study, leaving Claire in the living room with a cup of tea. After he closed the door, he pulled out his phone and texted Tom. Check Falcon Group connections to Bermuda. Any offshore accounts in Reed's name. Then he texted Emma. Claire has given me an update. Need your help with social media. My office, 10 a.m. tomorrow. He didn't mention the way Claire had looked at him over dinner, the way her voice had trembled as she thanked him. Emma mustn't know what he was feeling, not anger, but something he didn't want to name. He opened his laptop, logged into LexisNexis. A search for Falcon Group confirmed Tom's information, a Delaware firm with a reputation that teetered on the edge of legality. Their name had cropped up in tax evasion cases, but there was no hard evidence. If Michael was involved, it was a gold mine. Daniel began drafting a letter to the IRS, formulating an anonymous complaint. Suspicious transactions, possible money laundering through Reed Consulting. He knew how to frame it so that the investigation would start without his name. There was a creak of floorboards downstairs. Claire walked into the office, holding a mug. Her sweater had slipped off her shoulder, revealing the same bruise he had noticed yesterday. His anger flared, but he hid it behind a smile. Can't sleep? He asked, closing the laptop. I just wanted to say thank you, she said, her voice soft. For dinner, for not throwing me out. Daniel stood up, walked over to her, and put his hand on her shoulder. The gesture was gentle, but his mind was elsewhere. You have nothing to thank me for, he said. We'll figure it out. Go to sleep. She nodded, her eyes lingering on him as if searching for something: forgiveness, love, truth. But Daniel turned away, his gaze falling on her painting in the living room, visible through the open door. The blue brushstrokes now seemed like a cage into which he had trapped her and himself. When she went to the bedroom, he went back to his laptop, opened Westlaw, and checked Michael's old cases. A 2018 lawsuit he'd settled had hinted at fraudulent invoices. If he tied it to Falcon Group, he could file a complaint with the bar, accusing Michael of unethical conduct. That would get him out of the bar and maybe even out of jail. Daniel jotted down a plan: 1 IRS complaint, 2 letter to the bar, 3 Tom's criminal case file. Claire, without knowing it, had given him the first move. They tried to hide this story, but we will show it. Subscription is required. He thought of Emma, her determination, her hand on his shoulder in Providence. She had been his ally, but her look, her words of revenge, had been too personal. How would she feel if she knew Claire was sleeping in their bedroom? He pushed the thought away. He needed Emma to complete his plan. And Claire, she was a tool, even if her tears made him feel a little sorry. Outside, the wind rustled, throwing leaves against the glass. Daniel stood and walked to the window, looking out at the dark streets of Back Bay. His double-life gentle husband and cold strategist was like a trial, where he was both prosecutor and witness. Claire didn't know that every step she took now served his purpose. But the game was becoming dangerous. What if she figured it out? Or what if Emma decided he'd let Claire too close? He didn't know the answers, but he knew one thing. Michael would pay, and the new rules were in effect. The dim light of Manchester's streetlights reflected off the puddles on the sidewalk, and the Bean and Brew coffee shop hummed with the quiet hubbub of evening customers. Daniel Harper sat at a table by the window, his fingers tapping the leather folder that held the contract that was his weapon. The smell of freshly brewed espresso mingled with a cold air that blew in every time the door opened. He was waiting for Michael Reed, the man who had stolen his wife, betraying their friendship. Tom Keller, his detective, had tracked Michael down, a flat in Manchester, rented in cash after fleeing Providence. Daniel had texted him yesterday, "Mike, need to talk. There's a way out of your problems. 7 p.m., Bean and Brew." The reply came 3 hours later, curt and guarded. "Okay, we'll be there." Daniel adjusted the cuffs of his shirt, his expression calm, but a storm raging inside. Michael had slept with Claire, left a bruise on her wrist, and destroyed their marriage. And yet Daniel knew that anger would not win this game. He had to be cool, like in court, where every sentence was a step toward victory. Emma, his ally, had helped create a trap. A shell company, Northbridge Investments, dressed up with her marketing precision website, logo, fake testimonials. The contract in front of him would lure Michael into financial trouble, tying him to transactions that the IRS was about to investigate based on Daniel's anonymous complaint. The door rang. Michael walked in, his dark coat hanging loosely around his waist, and there were shadows under his eyes. His gaze, once sparkling with confidence, was dull, like a man who had been cornered. He noticed Daniel, but he didn't smile, and his steps were slow, as if he were going into an interrogation. Michael sat down across from him, crossing his arms, his fingers fiddling nervously with the hem of his sleeve. "Dan," he said, his voice hoarse and slightly shaky, "I didn't think you'd want to see me. After everything." Daniel's jaw tightened, but his smile was perfect. "Life is strange, Mike. Coffee?" Michael shook his head, his eyes scanning the coffee shop as if searching for a trap. "Why are you here? I know Claire's back. Did she tell you?" The mention of Claire hit like a fist, but Daniel didn't flinch. He leaned closer, his voice even, almost friendly. "She's told you enough, but I'm not here to talk about her. I know you're in trouble. Debts, the Falcon Group, threats. I can help, like old times." Michael frowned, his fingers still. "Help? After what I did? Are you serious?" "Seriously," Daniel lied, his tone warm, but his eyes as cold as a Boston winter. "We were friends, Mike. I got you out of a hole before in 2018, remember? The fraud lawsuit. I hold no grudge. But this is the last time." Michael looked away, his cheeks tense. He knew he had betrayed Daniel by taking Claire, but his despair was stronger than his guilt. Claire had told him about the calls from debt collectors, the threatening letters, the $200,000 bill from the Falcon Group. Michael was on edge, and Daniel could see it in his hunched shoulders, in his nervous movements. "What kind of help?" Michael asked, his voice wary but with a hint of hope. "I'm in no position to play games." Daniel opened the folder and pulled out the Northbridge Investments contract. Emma had spent 2 days creating the illusion, a website with glossy promises, fake LinkedIn investor profiles, even a fake press release about a promising startup. The contract asked Michael to invest $50,000 in exchange for a share of the profits. In reality, the signature would tie it to transactions Daniel had already set up for IRS audits, fictitious transfers tied to the offshore companies Claire had mentioned. "It's a startup," Daniel said, his voice as confident as if he were in a courtroom. "Technology, green energy. Investors are ready, but they need someone with your experience. You invest money, you get a profit in 3 months. Enough to deal with Falcon Group." Michael took the contract, his eyes running over the lines. "Where do I get 50 grand? I'm broke, Dan." "You have connections," Daniel replied, his tone becoming a little sharper. "You've always found money. Sell something, borrow. This is your chance to fix it. Or do you want the Falcon to come after you?" Michael swallowed, his fingers tightening around the paper. "Why are you doing this? After Claire, I don't deserve this." Daniel felt his anger flare, but he pushed it down, remembering Emma's words, "Don't let him get away." He leaned closer, his voice quieter but firmer. "Because I'm not you, Mike. I don't abandon my friends, even when they're wrong. But I'm not a charity case. Sign this or deal with it yourself." Michael stared at him, his eyes searching for a catch, but desperation got the better of him. He pulled out a pen, his hand shaking as he wrote his signature. Daniel watched the ink hit the paper, Michael signing his conviction. The contract would tie him to transactions the IRS would find suspicious. Daniel's complaint, backed up by Claire's information about the Falcon Group and the offshores, was already sitting in Tom's office, ready to be sent. One step, and Michael would be under investigation, with evidence that would destroy him. "I won't forget this," Michael said, his voice weak, almost broken. "Thank you, Dan." Daniel took the contract, his smile perfect as a mask. "I'll connect you with investors tomorrow. Don't disappear." He walked out of the coffee shop, the cold Manchester air hitting his face. He got into the Audi and texted Emma. He signed, "Preparing for the IRS." She replied, "You did it. Call me, we'll talk." Daniel felt a pang of guilt not for Michael, but for Claire, sleeping in their house, unaware that her words had fueled this trap. He thought of her bruise, her shaky voice, but he pushed it aside. Emma was right. Michael had to pay. The road to Boston was dark, the highway lights flickering like questions. Michael was caught, but the game wasn't over. What if he suspected? What if Claire found out? Daniel gripped the steering wheel, feeling the new rules he'd set growing more dangerous. Rain pounded the windows of Daniel Harper's townhouse, turning Boston into a blurry watercolor. In his second-floor office, the light from his desk lamp caught his face, focused and cold, like a chess player about to make his final move. On the desk was a folder containing a copy of the Northbridge Investments contract that Michael Reed had signed in Manchester 5 days earlier. Forged documents, a recorded conversation in a coffee shop, altered bank transactions the web Daniel and Emma had woven had tightened. Today, it would be torn apart. Daniel leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping on the phone. Tom Keller, his detective, had reported yesterday. The IRS, having received an anonymous complaint from Daniel, had of course begun an investigation into Northbridge Investments transactions. The fictitious $50,000 transfers that Michael had signed off on were linked to an offshore account set up by Emma through fictitious intermediaries. The recording of their conversation in the coffee shop, in which Michael mentioned the Falcon Group and Bermuda, had been the icing on the cake evidence given to Tom to accidentally leak to the FBI. Michael had unknowingly stepped into the abyss. The phone vibrated. A message from Tom. "He's been picked up. Manchester, 6 a.m. IRS and FBI. Call." Daniel felt his pulse quicken, but his face remained still. He dialed Tom's number, putting the phone on speaker. "Details," he said, his voice as even as in a courtroom. "They raided his apartment," Tom said, his voice hoarse with satisfaction. "Charges, money laundering, tax evasion. They found a contract, transaction records." He screamed that it was a mistake, called your name, but they wouldn't listen. Daniel nodded, his eyes narrowing. Michael had mentioned him. It was a risk, but he was willing to take it. The contract seemed legitimate, and his role as a friend who suggested a deal was not suspect. He thanked Tom and hung up, feeling triumph mixed with cold anxiety. Claire, asleep in the bedroom, didn't know that her stories about Michael's debts and the Falcon Group had fueled this operation. Emma, waiting for his call, would have been delighted, but the game wasn't over. He turned on the television in the living room, where the morning news was already blaring. A report from Manchester. Local solicitor arrested on suspicion of financial fraud. Michael Reed, 38, linked to suspicious transactions through Northbridge Investments. A frame flashed across the screen. Michael handcuffed, his face contorted with shock and anger, walking between FBI agents. Daniel watched, his lips pressed into a thin line. This was the man who had sat at their table, drunk his wine, and slept with his wife. Now he was in a cage. Claire walked down to the living room, her footsteps quiet, but Daniel heard the creak of the floorboards. She stopped when she saw the TV, her eyes widening. "Is that Michael?" she whispered, her hand going to her wrist, where the bruise had faded but was still a reminder of his rage. "Yes," Daniel said, his voice soft, as if he were consoling. "He got caught. Debts, fraud. You were right, he's in trouble." Claire sank down onto the couch, her face white. "I didn't think it would go this far," she said, her voice shaking. He deserved it, but—" Daniel sat down next to her, putting his hand on her shoulder, his gesture gentle, but inside he was cold as steel. "You're safe," he lied. "This isn't your problem anymore." She nodded, her eyes still glued to the screen. Daniel watched her, feeling his double life as caring husband and ruthless strategist stretched taut. Claire didn't know that her words about the Falcon Group, about Michael's calls, about Bermuda, had become bricks in his plan. She was a pawn, and her ignorance made his victory bitter. By midday, Daniel was in his office in downtown Boston, where he met with Emma. She walked in, her dark hair pulled back into a high ponytail, her eyes bright with triumph. "Did you see the news?" she asked, sitting down across from him. "We did it, Dan." "Not exactly," he said, his voice calm, but inside he was calculating his next move. "The arrest is the beginning. Now the deal." Emma raised an eyebrow, her smile sharp. "A deal? You want him to get out of this?" "No," Daniel said, opening his laptop. "I want it to be mine. All of it." The plan was simple but brutal. Michael, under pressure from money laundering charges, would face a choice: years in prison or a deal with prosecutors. Daniel, through his connections in the legal community, had already spoken to an assistant prosecutor, an old acquaintance from Harvard. The terms of the deal he proposed were a trap. Michael would cooperate by giving up the Falcon Group and its offshore schemes, but in exchange he would sign an agreement that obligated him to work under Daniel's control. Any deviation would send him back under arrest. It was an addiction worse than prison. Michael would become a puppet, his reputation and freedom in Daniel's hands. "How are you going to do that?" Emma asked, her voice full of admiration but also a little worried. "If he suspects you're behind this—" "He won't," Daniel replied, his eyes meeting hers. "The contract is clean. The recording of the conversation is just evidence. He thinks I helped him, and the IRS thinks he got himself into trouble." Emma nodded, but her gaze lingered on him. Daniel felt the hidden love he suspected complicated the moment. She was his ally, but her emotions were a risk. He thought of Claire, her tears that morning, and suppressed a pang of guilt. This was his web, and he wasn't going to get caught in it. That evening, Daniel received a call from a contact at the prosecutor's office. Michael, broken by his arrest, had agreed to a deal. He gave the names to the Falcon Group, but the terms were harsh. He had to pay a fine, work under supervision, and avoid any contact not approved by his handler, a role Daniel, through intermediaries, had assumed. Michael, unaware that Daniel was behind it, signed the agreement, thinking he had avoided prison. In reality, he had become his prisoner. Daniel returned home to find Claire preparing dinner, her movements slow, as if she was still processing the news. "Have you heard what's going to happen to him?" she asked, not looking at him. "A deal with the prosecutor," he replied, his voice neutral. "He'll get away with it, but he'll pay a price." Claire nodded, her eyes full of relief, but also fear. Daniel looked at her, feeling his victory growing heavy. Michael was at his mercy, but questions remained. What if Claire figured it out? What if Emma wanted more? The rain outside grew louder, its beat like a metronome, counting down the next move in a game where the web had been torn, but a new one was already being spun. A cold Maine dawn cast a gray light across the fields, casting a haze over the old farmhouse. The wooden house, with peeling paint and creaking steps, stood in overgrown meadows, the only sound broken by the wind blowing through the tall grass. Michael Reed, in a threadbare jacket and work boots, lugged a bucket of water toward the barn, his face covered in sweat despite the morning chill. Legally, he was there of his own free will, having signed an agreement as part of a plea bargain with prosecutors. In reality, it was a prison without bars, designed by Daniel Harper, who now held his life in his hands. 2 weeks ago, after his arrest in Manchester, Michael faced a choice: years in federal prison or a deal. The money laundering charges, backed by the Northbridge Investments contract, and a recording of his conversation with Daniel were ironclad. Daniel, through a contact in the prosecutor's office, offered a way out: cooperate with authorities against the Falcon Group and participate in a rehabilitation program on a remote farm in Maine. Michael, broken, signed the papers, thinking it was freedom. He didn't know that the program was a sham created by Daniel, and the farm was a cage where his every move was monitored. Daniel sat in his office in Boston, 300 miles away, staring at his laptop. A report from Walter, the hired manager, had come in that morning. Reed is working. No complaints. Phone confiscated, internet disconnected. Walter, an ex-military man recommended by Tom Keller, was watching Michael like a hawk. The agreement Michael had signed required him to report to a handler, a role Daniel had assumed through intermediaries. Any violation calls, attempts to leave, and he would be returned to custody. Legally, everything was clear. Michael had voluntarily chosen the farm. In fact, he was a puppet. Daniel leaned back in his chair, his fingers tightening around his pen. The plan he had started with Emma had worked perfectly. The fake Northbridge transactions, the coffee shop entry, Claire's data on the Falcon Group, it had all led to Michael's downfall. Now he was isolated, without freedom, without reputation, without a future. But Daniel didn't feel triumphant. The anger that had fueled him since Claire's departure was now mixed with emptiness. He remembered her bruise, her trembling voice, and his jaw tightened. Michael had paid, but the game was not over. Downstairs in the living room of the townhouse, Claire leafed through a magazine, her movements slow, as if she were afraid to upset the delicate balance of their lives. She knew about Michael's arrest from the news, but not about the farm. Last night at dinner, she had asked, "What's wrong with him now?" Daniel had answered evasively, "A deal. He's not coming back." Her eyes, full of relief, hid a shadow of curiosity. She hadn't known that her words about Michael's debts, about his calls, had become bricks in Daniel's plan, and he wasn't going to tell her. Emma walked into the office without knocking, her dark eyes aglow with a mixture of excitement and tension. "Have you seen the report?" she asked, sitting down across from him. "It's there, Dan. In the middle of nowhere. It's perfect." "Not exactly," Daniel said, his voice calm, but inside he was calculating the risks. "He's controlled, but not broken. If he starts digging, he might find some inconsistencies." Emma frowned, her fingers tapping the table. "You're being too cautious. We've won. He's trapped. The IRS is on Falcon's tail, and Claire, she doesn't even know." The mention of Claire cut him. Daniel remembered the look in her eyes that morning, when she had thanked him for the coffee. His double-life gentle husband, cold strategist, was growing more and more difficult. Emma, sitting before him, was his ally, but the way he sensed her in her pauses, in her glances, complicated everything. "Claire must not know," he said, his tone firm. "Never." Emma nodded, but her smile was strained. "Then what? Keep him there forever?" "That's enough for now," Daniel replied. "He's working, reporting. If he tries to escape, Walter will report him, and I'll file a new request with the prosecutor's office to extend the supervision." At the farm, Michael lowered the bucket, his breath steaming in the cold air. The barn smelled of hay and damp, its walls creaking in the wind. Walter, his face chiseled from stone, watched from a distance, holding the walkie-talkie. Michael had been told he was here for rehab work on the farm, a progress report, a chance to start over. But without a phone, without internet, without the right to leave, he felt caged. Every night he thought of Claire, her laughter, her departure, her return to Daniel. and of Daniel, whose help at the coffee shop had brought him here. He was beginning to suspect, but he had no proof. His tasks were simple but grueling: cleaning the barn, mending the fence, hauling firewood. An agreement, signed under duress, obligated him to follow Walter's orders and report to his handler. The letters he wrote once a week went through Walter, and Michael didn't know who read them. He tried to ask, but Walter just shrugged. That's the way it works. Michael felt his will bend, but his anger at Daniel, at Claire, at himself still smoldered. In Boston, Daniel opened LexisNexis, checking the status of Falcon Group. The IRS, thanks to his complaint, had launched an investigation into their offshore accounts, but Daniel wanted more. He was drafting a new document, a bar request accusing Michael of unethical conduct based on an old case from 2018. If Michael tried to break free, it would be another blow. He sent a draft to Emma with a note: add social media, any ties to Falcon. Claire, meanwhile, was growing restless. At dinner she asked, "You said Michael was under surveillance. Where is he?" Her voice was quiet, but her eyes searched for the truth. Daniel smiled, his hand brushing hers. "Somewhere it won't hurt," he said, his tone warm, but inside he was tense. "Don't think about it. We're starting over." She nodded, but her gaze lingered on him. Daniel could feel her questions growing more dangerous. If she dug deeper, his web might crack. He remembered Emma, her words: "Don't let her ruin everything." But Claire wasn't the only risk. Michael, isolated but unbroken, might find a way to contact the outside world. Or Walter might be wrong. The night in Boston was quiet, except for the rain pattering against the windows. Daniel stood at the window, looking out at the city lights. Michael was at his mercy, the farm his prison. But the questions multiplied. What if Claire found out? What if Emma wanted more? And what if Michael, in his isolation, began to see the threads of the web Daniel had spun? The game went on, and the stakes grew. Cold November rain pounded the windows of the Boston townhouse, turning the streets into mirrors that reflected the city lights. The living room, where Claire's paintings had once hung, was now silent except for the ticking of the wall clock. Daniel Harper stood by the fireplace, his fingers clutching a folder of papers, a divorce agreement, a prenuptial agreement, and a thin folder of dirt Emma had collected. Across the room, Claire sat on the couch, her face pale as a sheet, her hands fiddling with the hem of an old sweater. She had come home 2 months ago, broken and afraid, but now her time was up. Daniel had spun a web, and she was at the center of it. The plan started with Emma having succeeded. Michael Reed, Claire's lover, was sequestered on a farm in Maine, legally subservient to Daniel. But Claire was the last link. Her stories about Michael's debts, about the Falcon Group, about his aggression, had become the fuel for his arrest, but Daniel had no intention of bringing her back into his life. He wanted her banished legally, finally, with no chance of return. And today was the day. "Claire," he began, his voice calm, but with the cold precision of a lawyer in court. "We need to talk. About us." She looked up, her gaze wary. "About us?" she repeated, her voice shaking. "I thought we were trying to start over." Daniel opened the folder and pulled out a photograph, a snapshot from Providence, of Claire and Michael at a restaurant, her hand on his wrist. Emma had found it on social media, having recovered a deleted post through her connections. "That was 2 months ago," he said, setting the photo on the table. "You and Michael. You think I don't know?" Claire froze, her fingers clenching. It's not what you think," she began, but her voice was as weak as an autumn leaf. "Don't lie," he snapped, his tone sharpening but his face unreadable. "I know everything. Your affair, his debts, the Falcon Group. You told me about his calls, his letters. You knew about his schemes, Claire. It's called complicity." Her eyes widened, fear flickering across them like a shadow. "I wasn't involved," she whispered. I was with him. I didn't know what he was doing." Daniel pulled out another document, a wire transfer for $5,000 from the North Star Motel, signed with her name. Emma had used her skills to fish it out of public records, tying it to the Falcon Group. It wasn't a hard sell, but it was enough to scare. "Your account, your signature," he said, his voice as cold as the rain outside. "The IRS is already looking into Falcon. If I hand this over, you'll be under investigation, along with him." Claire shook her head, her hands shaking. "You won't do this," she said, but her tone was unsure. You said we could fix this." Daniel stepped closer, his eyes meeting hers. "I gave you a chance," he lied, his voice softer but still venomous. "But you chose it. Now you have two choices: sign the divorce and leave, or I turn everything over to the authorities. And trust me, Claire, I'm not bluffing." He placed the divorce agreement in front of her, a document he had prepared a week earlier, relinquishing her claim to the townhouse, their joint accounts, and any property. The prenuptial agreement, signed years ago, gave him the right to freeze her access to funds, and he had already done so yesterday, leaving her with a minimal amount in her personal account. Claire stared at the papers, her breathing becoming ragged. "It's not fair," she whispered, her eyes filling with tears. "You can't just kick me out." "I can," he said, his voice as firm as a sentence. "You betrayed me, Claire. You slept with Michael, my friend. You left, leaving a note, and now you think you can come back and everything will be like before? Sign, or the IRS will get your file." Claire picked up her pen, her hand shaking so badly that the ink blotted the first page. She began to read, but Daniel saw her eyes land on the property renunciation clause. "You're taking everything," she said, her voice filled with despair. "Even my studio, my paintings." "You chose this path," he said, his tone even, but inside he felt a pang of guilt. He remembered her paintings, her laughter, their evenings by the fire. But then he remembered Emma, her words, "She must not stay." And Michael, whose signature in Manchester had been his doom. Claire was the last link to be removed. She signed, her hand moving slowly, as if each letter were tearing out a piece of her soul. When she finished, her eyes met his, and there was something new in them, not fear, but understanding. "You planned this," she said quietly, her voice hoarse. "This isn't just a divorce. You wanted to destroy both of us, me and Michael." Daniel didn't answer, but his silence spoke louder than words. Claire stood up, her movements jerky, as if she were trying to hold on to some dignity. "I'll leave," she said, her voice shaking but steely. "But you won't win, Daniel. You've become like him." She went into the bedroom, packed her bag, the same one she had returned with. Daniel remained in the living room, looking at her signature. He expected triumph, but instead he felt empty. The fireplace crackled, but the warmth did not reach him. He opened the folder with the dirt, sorted through the photos' printouts. This was his victory, but it was cold. By morning, Claire was gone. Daniel walked into the bedroom, where the bed was made and her things were gone. On the nightstand was one of her paintings, a small canvas with blue brushstrokes like a storm. No note, no trace. He checked her account, and she had withdrawn her last $200, where she had gone to another state, to a friend abroad he didn't know. He wasn't going to look. Emma came into the office at noon, her eyes shining as she learned of the divorce. "You did it," she said, her voice full of admiration. "She's gone. It's just us now." Daniel nodded, but his smile was strained. Emma was his ally, but her words, her gaze, her closeness were becoming dangerous. He remembered Michael working on a farm in Maine, his letters full of suppressed anger, and Claire, whose final accusation, "You've become like that," echoed in his head. His web had destroyed them, but the threads were beginning to tangle. Outside, the rain had given way to wind, blowing leaves through the streets. Daniel looked out over the city, feeling his victory growing fragile. Claire was gone, but her words remained. Michael was controlled, but not broken. Emma was there, but her motives were becoming less clear. The game was still on, but he wasn't sure who the main player was anymore. Boston was a glittering night, but Daniel Harper's office, on the 15th floor of a downtown skyscraper, was pitch black except for the glow of a desk lamp. Files of documents, reports on Michael Reed, data on the Falcon Group, drafts of IRS complaints strewn across his desk like the spoils of a war he'd waged for months. Claire was gone, leaving behind only a painting and a signature on a divorce decree. Michael, isolated on a farm in Maine, was his puppet. But Emma, sitting across from him, whiskey in hand, was no longer just an ally. She was an equal partner, and her presence sharp as a blade was a game-changer. Emma leaned back in her chair, her dark hair falling around her shoulders, her eyes glittering in the dim light as she studied Daniel with a hint of amusement. "You look tired, Dan," she said, her voice low and warm, but with a steely edge. "There's no joy in winning?" Daniel smiled, but his gaze was as cold as a winter bay. "Victory. We're not done yet," he replied, opening his laptop. "Michael is under control, Claire is gone, but Falcon Group is still breathing. The IRS is digging, but slowly." Emma set her glass down on the table, her movements as precise as a predator. "Then let me speed things up," she said, pulling a flash drive out of her bag. "I found some stuff. Correspondence between Falcon and their middleman in Bermuda. Names, dates, accounts. If we get this to Tom, the IRS will close them in a month." Daniel took the flash drive, his fingers lingering on her arm longer than necessary. It wasn't the first time their touches had carried a charge, a tension that had grown with each encounter. Emma had been his ally from the start. Her marketing skills had built Northbridge Investments. Her connections had gotten dirt on Claire. Her determination had fueled his anger. But now she wanted more, not just to help, but to control. "How did you get this?" he asked, his voice even, but inside he felt uneasy. Emma was becoming too independent, and it was dangerous. "I have my own methods," she replied, her smile enigmatic, almost challenging. "You're not the only one who knows how to play this game, Dan. I want to be a partner, not an assistant. It's time to share the throne." Daniel sat back, his eyes narrowing. He remembered their first meeting in Providence, her words, "Make him pay." She had been a shadow then, urging him to take revenge. Now she sat before him, demanding equality, and her confidence was both alluring and threatening. "Partner," he repeated, his tone light but with a hint of steel. "It means you want half the risk and half the blame." Emma laughed, hers like tinkling glass. "I'm already in this," she said, leaning closer. "I created Northbridge, got Claire's photo, and kept Tom on a leash. Without me, you'd still be looking for Michael in motels. It's time to admit it, Dan. We're equals." Her proximity, her scent coffee with a hint of jasmine made his pulse quicken. This wasn't just a business connection. There was something real growing between them, but it was as dark as their plan, a mixture of attraction, mistrust, and a shared need for control. Daniel knew Emma was in love with him. Her looks, her pauses, gave it away. But he wasn't sure what she wanted more, him or the power. "Okay," he said, his voice calm, but inside he was calculating. "Partner. But partners share everything. What do you propose next?" Emma stood and went to the window, looking out at the lights of Boston. "Michael," she said, her voice hardening. "He's still a risk. Walter writes that he's asking questions, trying to contact someone. I suggest we tighten up the controls. No letters, just reports, and I want to go there. Make sure he doesn't slip up." Daniel felt a twinge of irritation. Emma wanted to take control of the farm, and that was more than he had expected. But her idea made sense. Michael, isolated but unbroken, could be a problem. "You want to be the overseer?" he asked, his tone caustic, but with a hint of admiration. "I want us to finish this," she said, turning to face him. Her eyes met his, and there was a spark there, not just determination, but something personal. "We've come too far to lose it, and I won't let Claire come back and ruin it." The mention of Claire cut him. Daniel remembered the picture of her left on his nightstand, her words, "You've become the same." He pushed the thoughts away, but Emma noticed his pause. "She's gone," she said, her voice quieter, almost intimate. "But you still think about her. It's a weakness, Dan." He stood up and walked toward her, stopping short. "You're wrong," he lied, his voice low and slightly menacing. "Claire is the past. But if you're a partner, I have to trust you. Completely. Emma didn't back down, her lips curling into a half smile. Trust is a two-way street, she said, her hand brushing his jacket, a light but deliberate gesture. Do you trust me, or am I just a tool? The moment hung like a blade over an abyss. Daniel felt her heat, her challenge, her danger. He could have pulled away, but instead he stepped closer, his hand on her waist. You're more than a tool, he said, his voice hoarse, and this time he wasn't lying. But partners don't hide their motives. What do you want, Emma? Her eyes darkened, but she didn't answer. Instead, she leaned down, her lips brushing his, a brief but searing kiss, full of promise and threat. Then she pulled away, her smile triumphant. I want it all, she said, and I'm going to have it. They left the office, heading for a corner bar where the low lights and jazz created the illusion of privacy. Over whiskey, they discussed the details. Emma would go to the farm in a week, check on Walter, make sure Michael was under control. She proposed a new move, a fake IRS report accusing the Falcon Group of more fraud to speed their downfall. Daniel agreed, but his mind was elsewhere. Emma was a partner, but her kiss, her words, had made her something more and something dangerous. He thought of Michael, whose letters Walter had intercepted had grown increasingly acrimonious, and of Claire, whose disappearance had left a void he didn't want to acknowledge. Emma, sitting across from him, was his mirror, just as ruthless, just as obsessive. But her motives were unclear. Did she want him, power, or just revenge? And if she was a rival, how far would she go? The bar was buzzing with conversation, but Daniel felt like he was in a vacuum. Their connection was real, but dark, like the Boston streets outside his window. The game was still going on, but now he wasn't sure who was holding the cards. Emma raised her glass, her eyes flashing. To partnership, she said, and her smile promised a storm. Winter had settled over Boston like an icy breath, turning the streets into a maze of light and shadow. On the 30th floor of Daniel Harper's new office, a glass and steel tower, the city lay before him like a chessboard on which he was the only player. The walls of the office, minimalist and cold, reflected his new reality: power, control, justice. Shelves filled with legal times sat next to monitors flashing Tom Keller's reports and Emma's data. This wasn't just an office, it was the center of his system, a personal machine of influence and punishment that he had built with the precision of an architect. Daniel stood at the picture window, his reflection in the glass as sharp as a portrait of a person he no longer recognized. Claire was gone, leaving behind only a painting and a signature on the divorce papers. Michael Reed, his former friend, was rotting on a farm in Maine, legally free but shackled by the chains of his agreement. The Falcon Group was cracking under the blows of the IRS, thanks to his complaints. Every step, from the sham Northbridge Investments contract to Claire's expulsion, was a brick in his system, where traitors paid a price. He felt like a judge, not just a lawyer, whose rightness was absolute. Betrayal, like a virus, demanded to be eradicated, and he was its executioner. Emma walked in, her heels clicking like a metronome on the marble floor. Her dark coat slid over the back of her chair, revealing a tailored suit that emphasized her new role: not assistant, but partner. She carried a file, but her gaze, sharp and warm at the same time, said more than the papers. Their bond, born in the shadow of revenge, was the dark thread that bound them together. She was his ally, but her ambition, her kiss at the bar a week ago, had made her something more and something dangerous. New report on Michael, she said, putting the folder on the table. Walter says he tried to hide a letter, wanted to send it to someone in Boston. Walter intercepted it. Daniel opened the folder, his eyes scanning the pages. Michael, despite the isolation, had not given up. The letter, addressed to an unknown person, hinted at suspicion. I know who's behind this. Daniel's jaw clenched, but his face remained still. He still thinks he can get out, he said, his voice as cold as the air outside. Increase surveillance. No contact. Have Walter search his room. Emma nodded, but her smile was small, almost challenging. You're always so calm, Dan. But Michael isn't the only threat. Claire could come back too, or talk. The mention of Claire cut like a knife. Daniel remembered her last words, "You've become like him." He pushed the image of her painting away, but Emma noticed his pause. "She's gone," she added, her voice quieter, possessive. "But you still have her in your head. It's weak." "You're wrong," he replied, his tone sharp, but his eyes betraying a shadow of doubt. "Claire is the past. You are the present. Partner." Emma stepped closer, her hand brushing his shoulder, the gesture light but deliberate. "Partner," she repeated, her voice husky, a hint of their dark connection. "Then let's talk like partners. I've found a new target, and it's bigger than Michael." She opened her laptop and launched a file. The screen showed a dossier: James Crow, 42, a businessman with ties to the Falcon Group. The photo showed a man with a smooth smile, wearing a $5,000 suit. The data Emma had collected was damning: transfers to offshore accounts, emails in which he discussed cleaning up assets, and rumors of betrayal by partners. Crow was a new client of Daniel's firm, hired to defend him against tax claims. But Daniel saw him not as a client, but as a traitor, another one who deserved to be punished. "He thinks we're going to save him," Emma said, her eyes shining. "But I checked his messages. He's willing to sell Falcon to save himself. If we play it right, he'll be ours." Daniel studied the file, his lawyer's mind already forming a plan. Crow was the perfect target: rich, confident, but vulnerable. Daniel's system, a web of legal traps, surveillance, and financial pressure, was ready. He could slip Crow a fictitious contract, record his conversations, freeze his accounts as he had with Claire. Tom Keller was already tracking his movements, and Emma could extract more through social media. This wasn't just business, it was justice. "How do you want to do it?" he asked, his voice calm, but inside he felt the excitement. Revenge had become his rhythm, his breath. Emma sat on the edge of the table, her proximity like an electric current. "We'll lure him in," she said. "We'll offer him a deal like we did with Michael. A shell company, wire transfers the IRS won't let through. I've already set up the framework, Capstone Ventures, registered in Delaware. You file a complaint as soon as he signs, and I'll make sure he trusts us." Daniel admired her confidence, her audacity, but he sensed a catch. Emma wasn't just suggesting a plan, she was taking control. Their connection, dark and real, was like dancing on the edge of an abyss, attraction mixed with distrust. He remembered her kiss, her words, "I want it all." But what did she want more, him or the system? "You're taking a risk," he said, his eyes meeting hers. "If Crow suspects, we're both in trouble. The IRS doesn't like lawyers playing their game." Emma laughed, her laugh like the clinking of glasses. "Risk is part of the deal, Dan. You taught me that. Or are you afraid I'll outsmart you?" Her challenge hung in the air like smoke. Daniel stood, his hand on her wrist, not squeezing, but holding. "I'm not afraid," he said, his voice low, almost menacing. "But partners don't hide their cards. Once you're in, you're in." She didn't pull away, her eyes flashing. "I'm in," she said, her voice warm but with a cold edge. "But don't forget, I'm not Claire. I'm not disappearing." The mention of Claire stung again, but Daniel suppressed it. He released her hand, returned to the desk, and opened Crow's file. "We start tomorrow," he said. "Write down his meeting. I'll prepare the contract. Tom will review his accounts." Emma nodded, her smile triumphant. They worked until midnight, sorting out the details: fictitious transfers through Capstone Ventures, forged letters from investors, a complaint to the IRS that would link Crow to the offshores. Daniel's system was a machine, honed to perfection. Every step, from surveillance to punishment, was his architecture, his rightness. He wasn't just exacting revenge, he was restoring order where traitors paid a price. As the clock struck midnight, Emma poured herself a whiskey from the bar in the corner of the office. She held the glass out to Daniel, her fingers brushing his. "For justice," she said, her voice soft but with a dark undertone. He took the glass, but his eyes were on Crow's file. For justice, he repeated, but his mind was elsewhere. Revenge had become his way of life, his religion. Claire, Michael, now Crow each was proof that he was right. But Emma, standing next to him, was more than just an ally. She was a mirror reflecting his darkness, and he didn't know if he wanted to see it reflected back. The office was silent. Only the hum of the city outside reminded him of the world outside. Daniel looked at Crow's photo, his smooth smile, his lies. He felt like an architect, building a world where betrayal was never forgiven. But the questions grew like shadows. What if Emma betrayed him? What if Claire returned? And what if his justice was just a mask for emptiness? He raised his glass and drank, but the taste was bitter. The game was on, and he was its master or its prisoner. Friends, thank you for being with us. Subscribe if you are interested in such stories. There are a lot of exciting things ahead. We are trying for you, and any support is a huge motivation to continue. If something can be improved, write in the comments with kindness. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one.